Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're going back to our friend, Mr. Beat. In fact, be prepared because in the next couple of weeks, you're going to see another collaboration between the two of us. So we'll be announcing more about that here in the very near future. But for now, I want to take a look at something that I've had some requests for the past 2 years to touch on the story of the Philippine-American War. It's not a part of history that people talk about a lot in American history. We talk about the Spanish-American War, which is connected to all of this, but really is a separate event, even though there was fighting that took place in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. In fact, maybe you've heard me mention the fact that my grandmother had a cousin who was actually the very first American killed in the invasion of the Philippines. He was the first guy off the boat to be killed when they landed on the beach, basically kind of a D-Day style thing that was happening there. And I visited his grave in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. His name was William Stillwagon. So I know a little bit about that part, but I really don't know a ton about the Philippine-American War, other than the fact that John J. Pershing was involved, the same John Pershing who would go on to be the American commander of the American Expeditionary Forces during the First World War. This is really kind of one of his first major combat situations. So, as always, a link is in the description to the original content. Matt's a great guy. He and I see the world very differently in some ways, but he's a great guy. I've had a chance to spend some time with him, and I consider him a friend. And he's at 888,000 subscribers right now. He's really climbed fast in the last year or so. So not going to be very long before he hits that million, and I'll be very happy for him when he gets there. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Are you Philippines? Filipino? Okay, I'll stop. I'm Mr. Beat, and I usually put bad jokes in my videos, like the one you just heard.
Don't try to be funny.
Yeah, but in this video, I'm gonna try not to do that, because this is serious stuff. This video...
By the way, I feel like I'm being mocked a little bit here by his facial hair. I get it. Everybody can grow a beard but me. Okay.
Is about a war you probably don't know much about.
Yeah.
If you're an American, you likely didn't hear much about it in American history class.
No, I
and
didn't.
That's likely because it's a war that the American government has preferred you just not remember. You see, this war makes the United States look bad. Very bad, as a matter of fact. It's a war that some historians say killed as many as 1 million people. A war in which American soldiers committed all kinds of atrocities, including pillage, torture, rape, and the massacre of civilians.
See, one of the things, and one of the reasons why I think we don't talk about this war, besides all of that, is... I can't speak for everybody, but I think that in a lot of cases we tend to judge the significance of wars by how many casualties our side had, right? So in World War I, again, a war that I think most Americans probably don't know much about, beyond November 11th is Armistice Day and it became Veterans Day here. The United States only had a little over 100,000 dead in that war. Now that still makes it our third deadliest war that we've ever participated in. But, you know, it's World War II and the Civil War, right? Those are the two deadliest wars in American history. Vietnam, I don't know, 50, 60,000 dead. Korea, about the same number. And because there weren't that many Americans who died in the Philippine-American War, it's just kind of a blip on the radar, right? But that doesn't mean there weren't a lot of people that died on the other side. You know, Iraq is the same way. What do we have, 4,000 or 5,000 dead from the United States in Iraq? But hundreds of thousands of others, especially Iraqis, maybe even more than that. Vietnam, same way. 55,000 Americans dead, but probably over 1 million dead altogether in that war. It just the impact on American troops wasn't that significant.
A war of imperialism in which the United States wanted to control the Philippines to exploit its resources and use it to expand trade throughout Asia. And
this is a point in history. This is not to excuse the United States doing it, but it's a point in history when that was what the great powers of the Western world were doing, right? And the Eastern world too, I guess. You know, this is what Germany and the UK and Belgium and France and others are doing. A lot of it in Africa for the European powers. But the United States sees its best opportunity, especially because this is a time in history when the United States Navy is becoming a player on the world stage. They're starting to try and project power through the Navy. And so Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam and Midway, and of course down in the Caribbean with places like Puerto Rico. It's all places that the U.S. has its eyes on.
The story of the Philippine-American War. Once upon a time, well, specifically, on April 30th, 1898, an American commodore named George Dewey sailed a small fleet into the Philippines, an archipelago made up of at least 7,100 islands in Southeast Asia. At the time, Spain controlled the islands, but it was quickly losing its grip over them. You see, for the past couple years, Filipino nationalists, or those who wanted the Philippines to break free from Spain so that it could be its own country, had been revolting. Led by Emilio Aguinaldo, these Filipino revolutionaries had had lots of success by the time Dewey showed up. All that was mainly left for them to capture was Manila, the capital of the Spanish East Indies.
So put yourself in the position of these Filipino nationalists for a minute. You are fighting to remove the shackles of a foreign power in Spain, and you've nearly done it when another foreign power comes along and just takes their place, and you're basically starting from scratch.
While the United States was now also at war with Spain in what became known as the Spanish-American War. So that's what had led Dewey to take his fleet to the Spanish-controlled Philippines. On May 1st, Dewey's forces attacked the Spanish Navy stationed at Manila Bay, easily defeating it. You see, Dewey's ships were made of steel, and the Spanish ships were wooded. The Spanish lost 350 men, the Americans lost 0, in what became known as the Battle of Manila Bay. Meanwhile, Aguinaldo wasn't even in the Philippines at this time. He was in Hong Kong. After hearing about the American victory in Manila Bay, he returned to the Philippines to resume the revolution. And here's the thing. While the Americans showed up acting like they were going to save the day, in reality, the Filipinos were likely going to kick the Spanish out of the islands anyway.
Yeah.
Under Aguinaldo's leadership, the Filipinos surrounded Manila and turned over 15,000 Spanish prisoners to the Americans. Aguinaldo and his forces also officially declared independence from Spain.
So that actually, I mean, that makes a lot of sense if you're Aguinaldo, right? We got 15,000 prisoners that we have to take care of and guard and feed. And it's just a whole lot easier situation if the Americans will take them off your hands. Frees you up to be able to do a lot of other things. But there's a certain level of trust there then, too, that you're trusting the Americans are kind of on your side because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Aguinaldo also declared himself president of the Philippines. Meanwhile, the German Navy also decided to show up acting like they were going to take over the Philippines now. Dewey sent a telegram back to the United States to request more troops so that the Americans could fully take over the Philippines. That said, Aguinaldo and Dewey had both agreed that they would join forces to take Spain down. We'll figure out the details later. Over the next 2 months, more and more American troops arrived in the Philippines, enough to scare the Germans away. Soon the 13,000 Spanish troops in Manila were completely cut off from the outside world. After Basilio Agustin, the Spanish Governor General of the Philippines, tried to surrender to the Filipinos, the Spanish Parliament was embarrassed and kicked him out of office, replacing him with a dude named Fermin Yodenes. Yodenes secretly worked out a deal with Dewey to have a fake battle in which Spain would surrender the Philippines to the United States, not the Filipinos. That fake battle, often called the Mock Battle of Manila, took place on August 13th, 1898. Even though the battle was fake, 19 Americans and 49 Spanish died in it. Regardless,
Could you imagine finding out that your son, your husband, your father died in something that was called the Mock Battle of Manila, that was meant just to be a show, but actual people actually died? This just goes to show you that the war is dangerous, right? Even when you're not trying to kill people, people die. When you have tens of thousands of armed men in confined locations, bad things happen.
Yanez surrendered Manila to the Americans, not the Filipinos, as they had agreed to, and that was the end of the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, for real. After this, the Americans sent a message to Aguinaldo telling him not to move his forces into the city. And this, you could say, made Aguinaldo quite upset. Mucho. President William McKinley even sent out a telegram that said, quote, "There must be no joint occupation with the Filipinos. The Filipinos and all others must recognize the military occupation and authority of the United States." This made imperialists in the United States, or those who wanted to expand the country's military and political influence beyond the boundaries of the country, quite happy. One such...
Again, this is all keeping up with the Joneses, right? Everybody else is doing it, so we're going to do it too. And so what that means is that everybody kind of ratchets up the level of colonization to try and keep up with the other people. And it's all bad. Other people are doing bad things, so then you got to do bad things, and now we're all doing it together. And who suffers? The people who are in these countries that are subjugated by these world powers. And the young men from these countries, these world powers that are sent to try and hold on to these places, that end up dying in these civil wars, these guerrilla wars, these uprisings that take place by these countries who just want their freedom.
Imperialist was Mark Hanna, a U.S. Senator from Ohio. Quote, "With a strong foothold in the Philippine Islands, we can and will take a large slice of the commerce of Asia."
So Mark Hanna, if you remember, throughout the years following presidential campaigns, every so often presidential campaigns have a very outspoken kind of campaign manager, somebody that becomes very, very familiar to people. And Mark Hanna was the guy behind William McKinley's successful campaign for president. Hanna is a Northeast Ohio guy himself, just like McKinley. Mark Hanna was born in Lisbon, which is 15 minutes from me. And in fact, when you drive into Lisbon, it says birthplace of Marcus Hanna, U.S. Senator. And so after he gets McKinley elected president, he runs for office himself and becomes a senator, and he's very, very influential with the president.
He said, on August 12th, the United States and Spain signed a ceasefire agreement. On December 10th, the two countries agreed on a peace treaty, unoriginally called the Treaty of Paris. That's the treaty that, among other stuff, gave Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. But
seriously, is everything the Treaty of Paris? Do you know how many treaties of Paris there have been? Vietnam War was ended by a Treaty of Paris. The American Revolution was ended by a Treaty of Paris. I know there have been others, but those are the ones that come to mind right off the bat.
Also let the United States buy all of the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, or $722 million in today's money. Yeah, the Spanish and the Americans didn't allow not one Filipino representative to attend the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris. Now that the United States was an official imperial power, a big debate splintered the country about whether or not being an imperial power was actually a good thing.
So this is not the first attempt by the United States to be an imperial power, right? Because you go back to Grant's administration, late 1860s, early 1870s, and Grant had a deal in place to acquire for the United States what we now know as the Dominican Republic. And some people wanted to use that as a recolonization point for former slaves. But it was an opportunity for the United States to expand into the Caribbean and to start kind of having these overseas, so to speak, holdings. But in the end, Grant couldn't get the government to sign off on it.
Anti-imperialists opposed the taking of the Philippines, mostly because it went against the values and ideals of the U.S. Constitution. The Filipinos, after all, wanted independence. They didn't have a revolution to kick one colonial power out, only to have yet another colonial power come in to oppress them. One of the most well-known of the anti-imperialists was the great Mark Twain.
So he makes a great point here in that, I know that it can be dangerous for us to try and apply our modern ideas and sensibilities and standards to other periods in history. But this is an important point to make, is that at the time there were people who opposed this and said this is not who we are as Americans, colonizing and taking away the right to self-determination from other groups of people. And there's a bit of, I guess you could say, hypocrisy in this, because 20 years later, you're going to have the United States and Woodrow Wilson and others saying, hey, these European powers, these countries need to have the right of self-determination. Countries like Czechoslovakia and Romania and Hungary and all these countries that have been a part of other people's empires. And yet here we are denying that right of self-determination to people that we've colonized.
Who wrote, quote, "I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris, and I have seen that we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem." Still, President McKinley traveled the country trying to convince everyone that the American occupation of the Philippines was actually a good thing, arguing that if the United States didn't control them, Germany or Japan would. Not only that, McKinley argued, the Philippines could make the United States more prosperous with its resources, eh? Yeah, the occupation of the Philippines remained controversial, especially after Aguinaldo decided that he was going to start a new revolt. A new revolt against a new colonial power. The United States.
Should have expected that.
Yep, he declared war on the United States.
I don't understand, and maybe the United States did expect this. I shouldn't assume that they didn't, but you have to think that's going to happen. If they were willing to revolt against Spanish rule, why would they not also be willing to revolt against American rule?
On February 4th, 1899, around the time that Congress and President McKinley ratified the Treaty of Paris, a firefight broke out between American soldiers and Filipino soldiers in Manila. Later that day, Aguinaldo officially declared, quote, that peace and friendly relations with the Americans be broken and that the latter be treated as enemies within the limits prescribed by the laws of war. The Philippine-American War had begun. Over the next day and a half, 55 Americans died and 238 Filipinos died in the first and biggest battle of the war.
So it's interesting that he specifically mentioned within the limits of the laws of war, because more often than not, these kinds of wars tend to be outside of what we consider to be normal or even proper, right? Because even though war is by nature killing one another and destruction and taking advantage of opportunities, we still have this kind of weird sense of honor when it comes to war, that there are certain lines you don't cross, and everybody has a different idea of what that is, right? In the American Revolution, the British were appalled by the fact that the Americans tended to target officers. Because they understood that they were at a disadvantage, and so the way to gain an advantage was take out the head of the snake, so to speak. In the First World War, the Germans thought that it was practically a war crime that Americans used shotguns. That's how that was viewed, right? While they were simultaneously using gas, and both sides were using gas. There had been the Geneva Conventions at that point, but, everybody has a different idea about what's acceptable in war.
1899 Battle of Manila, when the Filipinos tried to deliver a truce. Elwell Stephen Otis, the American military governor of the Philippines, rejected it. While the United States won that first battle, soon Aguinaldo and his troops had managed to take control of Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, and they refused to let American ships dock there. In response, President McKinley sent a fleet of new ships there to put down what the American government officially called an insurrection. Aguinaldo had
right, and you'll actually see it referred to that way, right, as the Philippine insurrection rather than a Philippine-American war.
100,000, quote, soldiers on his side, most of them untrained and armed only with spears, knives, bows and arrows, and other simple weapons.
And listen, I'm oversimplifying it to say this, but you can't see the parallels, right, between this and, say, the American Revolution. A bunch of farmers with their weapons that they have at home who aren't a professional trained fighting force going up against a powerful professional military.
The Americans? Oh, they had guns, of course. In the early months of the war, the United States mostly had success in conventional battles due to their superior weapons. Because of this, Aguinaldo had decided that the Filipinos' best hope was conducting guerrilla warfare, or a war fought by unconventional means. Aguinaldo had noticed that his soldiers were most successful with ambushes, or surprise attacks from concealed positions. He also had a very talented general on his side, Antonio Luna. Under Luna's leadership, the Filipino army was able to effectively terrorize American soldiers. Oh, and Luna's soldiers actually had guns. Luna's elite unit of sharpshooters even got the nickname, quote, marksmen of death. After this, the atrocities got significantly worse. First of all,
and this is what happens when you are an occupying force and you feel like these people don't know they're conquered. They keep fighting back. They won't just allow us to hold this. And they start doing these, I guess what you would call like underground tactics and those kinds of things. There start to be reprisals on the civilians. The Germans did this to Belgian civilians during the First World War when they occupied most of Belgium. And things would happen, and there'd be snipers or there'd be incidents. They would take it out on the civilian population, and there would start to be these atrocities.
American troops became increasingly frustrated with guerrilla warfare tactics because it eroded their trust with the civilian population. In other words, they generally stopped trusting pretty much all Filipinos. They began Scorched Earth campaigns, basically just destroying a bunch of the Filipinos' resources. They began relocating civilians to concentration camps. Yes, you heard that right.
It's really easy, again, to judge this stuff and say, man, this in hindsight looks horrible. But if you put yourself in position of one of these military leaders on the ground as Americans, first of all, it's not your decision, right? The decision to fight this war is way above your pay grade. You're dealing with, okay, I've got to protect my soldiers. I've got to deal with the situation on the ground. This is pretty much standard practice for dealing with that sort of thing. It doesn't make it right. The right thing to do would be to not even be there in the first place. But since you're there, this is typically how things are going to be dealt with.
Concentration camps, where thousands, at the very least, ultimately died from disease and starvation. They often cut off food from being transported to the villages they didn't burn down. There were also reports of American soldiers robbing civilians of everything they owned of value. There were reports of rape. Some American soldiers tortured prisoners. One well-documented way they did this was through something called, quote, the water cure. When a Filipino prisoner wouldn't say the right thing, American soldiers would hold them down and force them to drink a bunch of water in a short amount of time. They'd often hold their mouths open with a stick and close their nose with pincers so the water wouldn't come back up. On November 27th...
It's almost kind of a early form of waterboarding that was used a lot later in Iraq.
1900, American soldiers gave Jovellanos Ildama, a Filipino who was the mayor of the town of Igbaras, the water cure. Sergeant Edward Davis later testified about it.
After they filled him up with water, he swelled way up, and then these two soldiers would roll the water out of him. They had an interpreter over him, and they asked him if he would tell what information they were after. He told some, and then after they released him, they wanted further information out of him, and he would not give it. So they took him down right there, and they took a syringe and squirted water up his nostrils. He would not give the information then, and they put salt in the water. Then he was willing to tell.
I should say that most American soldiers were not doing this. In fact, they were probably just as disturbed as you are right now hearing about all this.
Yeah, we need to remember that this is not everyone. Unfortunately, in war, and this is true in all wars, when you remove the restraints on people that normally govern their lives in everyday society and you put them in situations where they can do stuff like this, the worst of humanity often comes out. And that's not unique to any group of people. It's, we like to blame the Germans for it in World War II or the Russians, but Americans did it. Americans committed atrocities in World War II. So did the Japanese, the Germans, the Russians. Pretty much every group of people did. There are always going to be those people who do those things.
Many began writing to the media to tell them of the atrocities. One soldier from New York wrote, "Last night one of our boys was found shot and his stomach cut open. Immediately orders were received from General Wheaton to burn the town and kill every native in sight, which was done to a finish. About 1,000 men, women, and children were reported killed. I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger." After the media published stories like this, many Americans back home got angry and began to protest the war. The War Department even conducted a major investigation. When Elwell Otis found out about his soldiers writing to the media, he freaked out, launching a major PR campaign to downplay these reports. He even tracked down some of the soldiers who wrote the letters, forcing them to write a retraction and court-martialing them if they refused to do so. But even generals were turning against Otis, like General Reeve of the 13th Minnesota Regiment, who wrote, quote, "It seems to me that we are doing something that is contrary to our principles in the past."
But it wasn't just American soldiers guilty of atrocities.
The Filipino soldiers tortured American prisoners too. There were reports...
And what happens when each side is doing this stuff? Well, again, the other side's going to respond, right? World War II, you have the very famous incident with the Malmedy massacre, SS soldiers massacring Americans. What happens in response? Americans from the 11th Armored Division massacre German soldiers. Your side tortures my side, well, now my side's going to do it back to you as a deterrent to show you what happens when you do it to us. And it just ramps it up.
That they buried American soldiers alive.
Here's another report.
An American prisoner had been buried in the ground with only his head projecting. His mouth had been propped open with a stick, a trail of sugar laid to it through the forest, and a handful thrown into it. Millions of ants had done the rest.
Goodness. Filipino soldiers reportedly mutilated American soldiers and slowly killed them so that they would suffer. By the end of the war, Filipino sharpshooters were targeting chaplains, doctors, nurses, and even wounded soldiers.
On June 5th, 1899, the Filipino Army lost its best general in kind of a crazy way.
Members of Aguinaldo's own cabinet assassinated Antonio Luna. This was a huge loss for the Filipino Army. On December 20th, 1900, General Arthur MacArthur, who had taken over as the American military governor of the Philippines after Otis stepped down a few months prior.
So you see Arthur MacArthur right there. He's wearing his Medal of Honor that he received at Missionary Ridge when he was, I think, like 19, a young officer in a Wisconsin regiment, and led his troops up Missionary Ridge. He is the father of Douglas MacArthur, who was very tied to the Philippines himself.
placed the entire Philippines under martial law. However, this just further eroded trust between American soldiers and Filipino civilians. By early 1901, things were not going well at all for the Filipino army. They had lost control of most of their territory and thousands of soldiers. But things really got discouraging for them after the capture of their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, on March 23rd, 1901.
And you have to figure this was a goal of the Americans, is to get their hands on him. If you can cut off the head of the snake, maybe you can disperse the rest.
American soldiers were able to capture him after pretending to be prisoners of war, escorted by other American soldiers in Philippine Army uniforms. Aguinaldo didn't give up much of a resistance. He was exhausted by that point and tired of seeing Filipinos killed. On April 1st, Aguinaldo swore an oath accepting that the United States did now officially control the Philippines. He even swore allegiance to the American government. On April 19th, he issued a formal surrender telling his followers to put down their weapons and give up the fight. That said, not all Filipinos were ready to do that, and sporadic hostilities would continue over the next 12 years.
Wow.
General Miguel Malvar took Aguinaldo's place as the new leader of the Filipino government, while he launched a series of new attacks on American troops for the rest of the year. Ultimately, he'd surrender too on April 16th, 1902. By this time, Theodore Roosevelt was now president after the assassination of William McKinley a few months prior. Once a huge imperialist, by now, even Roosevelt was questioning why the heck the United States was still fighting this war. He pushed for a solution to end the war and a path for the Filipinos to eventually govern themselves.
And remember, Theodore Roosevelt is himself a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and kind of an interesting connection between Theodore Roosevelt and Arthur MacArthur. Only twice in American history have fathers and sons both been awarded the Medal of Honor. Arthur MacArthur and his son Douglas. I'd question Douglas's Medal of Honor a little bit. Arthur definitely earned his. And Theodore Roosevelt and his son. It's confusing because he's technically, the president was Theodore Roosevelt Jr., but then his son is known as Theodore Roosevelt Jr. as well, when he was technically Theodore Roosevelt III. So his son, who got his Medal of Honor for D-Day, and it was only many years later that the father, President Roosevelt, got his Medal of Honor for San Juan Hill.
To help them do that, he appointed his friend William Taft as civil governor of the archipelago. Ultimately, the war ended. Well, the main part of the war ended when the United States government promised the Filipinos that they could self-govern as long as the United States government could still kind of control them and protect them and,
exploit their natural resources.
The main part of the Philippine-American War officially ended on July 2nd, 1902, after Congress passed the Philippine Organic Act, a law that included the establishment of a Bill of Rights for Filipinos and a Filipino-led representative government, assuming hostilities ended. Heck,
So really kind of a puppet situation is what we're dealing with here.
President Roosevelt even proclaimed full and complete forgiveness and amnesty to all Filipinos who had participated in the conflict.
That's
well,
helpful.
hostilities did end. Okay, they mostly ended. Technically, the war still carried on in the southern Philippines, where a group known as the Moros continued to resist American occupation in what became known as the Moro Rebellion. The Moros were only finally defeated after the Battle of Budbaksak on June 15th, 1913. After this, the United States controlled the Philippines and protected it. for the next 33 years. That's when the Philippines finally achieved full independence. The Philippine-American War was objectively a disaster for everyone involved.
Yeah,
It was a
that's fair.
painful reminder that imperialism often just leads to the horrible subjugation of a people. In fact, this war single-handedly turned Americans against imperialism, and even got the once staunch imperialist Teddy Roosevelt questioning himself. The war highlighted the importance of respecting the sovereignty of other nations. It also exposed the terrible racism toward Filipinos. American soldiers done messed up with their treatment of them.
Okay,
In
wait.
conclusion, you probably weren't taught much about the Philippine-American
True.
War in history class, unless you're Filipino, of course. But it's an important war that we need to learn from. But Mr. Beat, are you bringing up this war because you hate America? No, I am bringing up this war because we must learn from the mistakes of the past in order to achieve our goals of peace, justice, and equality. After all, if we ignore these mistakes of the past, we're more likely to just repeat them.
Absolutely true. And so I appreciate him saying that at the end. I think that's really important, and I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up as well. Add to the conversation. Use the comment section below. Let's talk about it. Let's keep it civil. We can discuss things. We can disagree with each other without being disagreeable. So I think it is important for us to learn from the mistakes of the past, and every country has made mistakes. Some countries have made bigger and more costly mistakes than others, but we all have things we can learn from and do better in the future. So I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.